Hello everyone, welcome to our final lecture in the series Competition Policy and Strategy. Chapter J, Abuse of Dominance. So before we start, please make sure to like the video. Feel free to leave comments in the comment section below, and we would appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. So, this is the final chapter. How does this all tie together? Well, today we're going to talk about abuse of dominance, or more in a wider term, what could potentially lead to abuse of dominance. So first of all, we're going to understand what abuse of dominance actually means. So it's of course related to market power. And we're also talking about certain forms which may or may not fall into this category. And for instance, could be price discrimination. It couldn't be that there are instances where this is completely unproblematic, but there are other instances where it is, and the same applies to rebates, right? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So first of all, what is abuse of dominance? Well, in the EU, it's actually related to 102 Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union, and it says that basically an undertaking that has market power should not, or in that case it's called a dominant position, it has a lot of market power, this undertaking or firm should not abuse this dominant position in a way that is incompatible with the internal market. That is, it shouldn't affect trade between effective trade between member states. So basically it shouldn't affect competition. And then we have some examples here given in the respective article, and that it says that we should not impose directly or indirectly unfair purchase or selling prices or trading conditions. We shouldn't limit production, markets, or technical development. We shouldn't apply dissimilar conditions to equivalent transactions with trading parties. That could refer to price discrimination in a sense, and that places them at a competitive disadvantage. And we shouldn't basically offer contracts that lead the parties to be in a, or the other parties to be in a position that they are reliant on us in a way that harms competition, basically. Okay, so we have this guideline, COM 2008-832, where this is put into perspective in more detail. And there it is basically said, and that's important, a dominant market position per se is not illegal. So you're not doing anything wrong if you're a monopolist. That would be kind of strange. However, it comes along with a responsibility, right? With a special responsibility. So if you're basically a small firm without a lot of market power, you do not have so many responsibilities, these responsibilities that a firm with a dominant market position has. And this responsibilities comes along with the obligation that the dominant market position shouldn't be abused, in a sense that it should not impair competition. We apply the consumer standard here, so we look at the consumer surplus, and if we want to assess that market or the abuse of dominance, then the first question we have to ask is whether the firm has a dominant position. If you do not have a dominant position, it is impossible that you abuse that dominant position, right? So that is something that has to be satisfied. And the second question, quite logically, is whether the firm abuses its dominant position. And if 1 and 2 are satisfied, we have an abuse of dominance case. We could have a dominant position not only be related to a single firm, it could be even more undertakings. And the point is that the economic strength that comes along with the dominant position might enable the prevention of competition, and that would be a problem. And also the dominant position allows the firm or the firms to behave basically independently of their competitors, and that's basically the point. And like the abuse of dominance, as we have basically already hinted at, could be related to a market power related increase in prices or decrease in quantities above or below the competitive level, right? So if you're basically imposing monopoly prices or producing monopoly quantities, then this could be an issue, right? So if you're a monopolist and that's basically the market solution that you're selling for the monopoly price, then well, you have a monopoly, but you shouldn't do that in an illegal fashion, right? So you shouldn't abuse this position. And it's also crucially related to expansion and market entry, right? So we have briefly talked about entry deterrence. If you, as a dominant firm, deter entry, that could be an issue, right? Because that could be an abuse of dominance case, because once you have eliminated all potential competitors, you're basically free to exert your full potential of market power. And that the way you got there would be illegal, as you have engaged in entry deterrence, which would be basically abuse of dominance. Okay, so when do firms have a dominant position? Well, in the EU there is no clear guidance, but in Germany at least there is paragraph 18 of the respective law, Gesetz gegen Wettbewerbsbeschränkung, GWB. There it is said that the market share of a single firm has to be above 40%. 2 or 3 firms joint market share has to be above 50%, or 4 to 5 firms joint market share should be above 2/3. This is basically, if this is satisfied, we basically expect market power here. Of course, we have to take into account entry and entry barriers. As I said, entry deterrence is an issue, but if it is easy to enter a market, then you basically won't expect the position to be dominant, or respective high market shares would be a transitory effect, right? So if you're in a very infant industry where there's a lot of movement in the market, it could be that at a certain point in time market shares are high, but wait for half a year and then the situation might completely change due to entry. Then that's also important to take into account countervailing power. Countervailing power refers to the downstream firms or the buyers that the dominant firms or potentially dominant firms face. And if they are dominant as well, in the sense that they have buyer power to a large extent, they have a good bargaining position, then we could basically expect the dominant position to be eliminated due to countervailing power. When we assess market power, right, so once we have cleared that we have dominant position, the point is also that we need to think about what market power actually is. And we think about market power as super competitive prices, or prices above a competitive level. But in that case, it's also relevant to think about the counterfactual. So what would happen if the firms did not have market power, or if there was basically more firms in the market, right? And we have also already learned that in some instances, it's basically efficient to have more firms in the market. It's basically inefficient to have more firms in the market, right? So think about a regulated network industry where it basically makes sense to have only one firm, right? And then this firm has a dominant position, and we should, if it's like important, we should regulate it, right? So that's something related to that. Or probably we could regulate it. We don't have to necessarily. And then it's also important nowadays, actually, to think about data, right? So we have talked about platform markets in the last lecture. One crucial aspect of these platform markets were social media platforms, and they basically have access to big data, so a large amount of data that is related to a lot of consumers. And there's also the issue. So, for instance, the Digital Market Act actually refers to abuse of dominance that is related to data, and related to that, or related to the Digital Market Act, and also related to our topic here in 102 is actually that could refer also to 101 infringements, which we have been talking about before, namely algorithmic pricing, for instance, right? So you could have instances where data allows you to learn and to set algorithms that actually collude, right? So that's a very novel topic. in a sense, but not particularly related to 102, but 101. But nevertheless, it's important to note that in the digital era, we have to also take into account that data, so the pure information of consumers, might lead to situations that affect not only 102, but also 101. In a sense, right? And that's why we have introduced the Digital Markets Act, where we actually pose more scrutiny on large internet platforms such as Amazon, Google, you know, all this stuff, Facebook, and so on. Okay, so let's talk about basic cases of of abuse of dominance. So one example is, or would be, entry returns. One example would be here exclusive dealing, right? So you as a dominant firm say that you only sell to firms A and B, and that would be an instance of another firm, downstream firm, not being served by you, and that could lead to entry returns. Tying and bundling could be in a similar case, right? And then we could have predation. Predation would mean that you set very low prices in some periods and just drive out a competitor or avoid entry of competitors, and that would lead, once the competitors are eliminated, to higher prices in the end, once you have a stable monopoly position that is not contested. Then we could have refusal to supply, right? So we could have a downstream firm that is refused to be supplied by a dominant firm. We will talk about that in the context of essential facilities. And then we could also have margin squeeze, where we basically say that, okay, we impose certain measures such that your margins are reduced down on the downstream level. What we also have to think of is efficiency effects, right? So we said we would assess the consumer, we take the consumer standard as a measure here, and what we want to know is whether there is a benefit to consumers, right? And that involves, for instance, innovation or cost reduction, and it shouldn't impair competition. The point is that especially this benefit to consumers is something we will address in the context of price discrimination. So let's go back to a more broader overview here. So we could have a situation where a buyer purchases exclusively from one dominant seller, and then we could have an issue of conditional rebates, right? Well, that would be an example where we could have a situation of abuse of dominance here, and another instance would be conditional rebates, where we have retroactive rebates or incremental rebates. That would be examples where, due to a thought-out rebate scheme, you as a dominant firm attract consumers such that they have no incentive to change the supplier at a certain point. We will have an example later. We could have the potential effects of foreclosure here. Again, we have been talking about this, so foreclosure we have said that you could have input foreclosure or customer foreclosure, right? And once you have like a dominant firm upstream, we could have the foreclosure aspect that a downstream firm is no longer supplied with an input, right? So that's related to the essential facility debate here. Another point is price discrimination that might or might not harm consumers or buyers. And with price discrimination, we have to distinguish basically between three types here: first, second, and third degree. With first degree price discrimination, we have a situation where the seller exactly knows what the buyer is willing to pay, and that usually allows the seller to extract the entire consumer surplus by setting basically individual prices. Right? You could, for instance, use a two-part tariff here. Second degree price discrimination would be a situation where there are types of consumers and the seller knows these types, but he does not know which particular consumer or buyer has, which type a particular buyer actually has, right? But he has a prior belief on the distribution of buyers, and that allows the seller to design menu or a two-part tariff scheme or rebate scheme that allows to extract consumer surplus. You will not be able to extract consumer surplus perfectly because there is uncertainty. Well, usually you cannot. So it's basically from the viewpoint of the sellers less. You will be left in the second best solution in some instances, but you still can overcome this uncertainty problem in a way. If we look at third-degree price discrimination, we know that there are basically two groups or several groups of consumers, and we set group-specific prices. For an example would be student tariffs, where you go to a cinema and you show your student ID and then you get a rebate. That would be an example of third-degree price discrimination. Today we're going to talk about third-degree price discrimination. First and second degree is something that I would advise you to check the IO course that is also available on Economics to Go, where we dig into much more detail on the first and the second degree as well. Okay, so let's talk about third-degree price discrimination. And we use a model setup where there's a monopolist that produces a homogeneous product with constant marginal cost C. The monopolist serves two groups of consumers, which are indicated by I, and the groups are either 0 or 1, so that's just the reference. These groups could be, for instance, two countries. For instance, a rich country and a poor country. That would be an example, right? Or you have high-income consumers, low-income consumers. That would be an example here. The demand functions differ between the two groups. That's why we have to have some certain, types of distinction here, and that is that each consumer group has a linear function, a linear demand function, but the intercept is potentially different, and the slope is the same, right? But the price may be different between the two groups, and that's the potential for price discrimination which we talk about. And we say that the demand in group 2 is by definition lower than that of group A. That's without loss of generality. You could just change the indices, but that's just the assumption that we have one. You could say that group 1 is a high-income group that has a higher demand, or it could be a group that is much more, that needs a certain product more urgently, right? So an example would be you need to book a flight before Christmas, because you have to visit your parents, whereas there's maybe other consumers that basically only go on holiday and they don't necessarily have to go at a certain date. They could wait another day or something, and their willingness to pay for the particular flight could be lower, right? So that could be a difference here. Okay, so we are going to distinguish between two scenarios. Scenario 1 is a situation where we have no price discrimination. That's called a uniform price. And in scenario 2, of course, we have price discrimination. So we have group individual prices. And so for uniform prices, we set an identical price for both groups, right? And then the crucial point is that we have to set up a joint demand function here. Joint demand function, why? Well, we have basically a group 1 that has demand Q1, and we have a group 2 that has demand 2, right? And group 1 has an intercept A1, and group 2 has an intercept A2, right? And we set a uniform price. So now, what is important here? Well, usually you would say, okay, for any given price, the demand for each group takes a certain value, and you just add up the two values, so the two demands of the groups, and then you have your joint demand, right? So for instance, if you say that A1 is 20 and A2 is 10 and the price is 5, then you could easily say 20 minus 5, 15 is the demand in group 1, 10 minus 5 is 5, that's the demand in group 2, so 15 plus 5 would be 20, so our joint demand would be 20. However, there is one problem. If the price exceeds A2, then demand in group 2 will be 0. But if you only add up Q1 and Q2 here, just the two functions, we would ignore that. And that's something that from an economic point of view wouldn't make sense, as the demand cannot be, as demand of group 2 cannot be negative, right? So that we have to take into account this kink in the demand functions here that says that the price, if it exceeds A2, will lead to a situation where only group 1 has positive demand, right? And that's basically what we have here. So what we have in the first line here, or in the first part of this stack demand function, is the sum of the two demands here, Q1 and Q2. But that only applies to situation where the price is below A2, right? So in our example with A120, A210, we would have this joint demand function here, summed up over the two demands, only for cases where the price is below 10. Because if the price exceeds 10, demand in group 2 will be 0, right? And that leads us directly to the next point here, to the next part of this function, where the price exceeds A2. And if the price exceeds A2, as I said, the demand for group 2 will be 0, so the relevant demand will only be that of group 1, right? So think of our example here. Assume that A2 would be 10. Then our demand would be, if the price is below 10, we would have 10 plus 20, so 30 minus 2p. If we have a price above 10, the only relevant point, or the only relevant demand comes from group 1, and our intercept in group 1 is 20, so the demand function will be 20 minus p. Right? So that is basically what we have here. Okay, now based on that information, what will the monopolist do? Well, it will maximize profits. How does it maximize profits? It maximizes profits over this function here, which is the demand function, times price minus marginal cost, right? And you basically have two intervals here, right? So you take first this upper interval here, which is A1 plus A2 minus 2p, and you maximize in that range over the price the profit function. And that's exactly what we have here. And then this would be the resulting monopoly price. However, we have to take into account two things. The first thing is that this monopoly price must not exceed A2, because if it exceeds A2, then we would basically pose a monopoly price based on a joint demand function. However, we are not in the joint demand function range here, right? Because if this monopoly price that we calculated based on the joint demand exceeds A2, then the joint demand doesn't exist in the first place, economically speaking. So what basically happens is that the monopoly price would be too high for group 2 to buy, and then we would be reliant only on group 1, right? So the first thing we have to check is whether the monopoly price that we calculated based on our joint demand is too high for group 2 to buy, right? And we check that by just checking whether this P hat M, so our monopoly price over the joint demand, exceeds A2 or not. If it does, then the price is invalid. If it does not, it's okay. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is that the monopolist does not necessarily have to serve group 2, right? So we basically have to check whether it makes sense for the monopolist to actually set a monopoly price, P hat M, such that both groups are served, right? What does this mean? Well, you calculate the monopoly profit based on your joint demand function with your, basically, let's call it joint monopoly price, P hat M, and that would be it, right? And this has to, for this to be a valid solution, it has to hold that, how do we say that? We should say that it's necessary to have P hat M to be below A2, right? So if we can assure that P hat M is below A2, then this would be our monopoly profit if we serve both groups with this uniform monopoly price that is actually consistent with a positive demand in both groups. However, as I said, the monopolist doesn't have to do that. The monopolist could say, well, I only serve group 1 with the monopoly price in group 1, right? So we basically, in that case, would say this is our relevant consumer group, and given this demand function, we maximize our profits and set one monopoly price for group 1, which is basically this term here, right? So that would be the monopoly price in group 1, if the monopolist only serves group 1. And based on this price, and based on the fact that he only will serve group 1 in that case, the monopolist earns a profit, right? And that would be, let's call that hat M. And if he chooses to serve only group 1, then we would have the profit function, we have it here, just Q1 PM1 PM1 minus C, right? Note that at this monopoly price, group 2 won't be served because basically, by definition, it's the situation that firm 2 will not be served if the monopolist sets a monopoly price for group 1, for the larger group actually. So if you want to check whether this P hat M, so the uniform price that is consistent with both groups being served at a uniform monopoly price, is actually a valid solution, you have to check whether the profit that the monopoly earns by doing this, by pursuing this strategy, is larger than the monopoly profit for the case that the monopolist only serves group 1 for the monopoly price in that group, right? So you compare this profit with this profit and look whether this profit is indeed higher. So if P hat M is higher than PM1, we have a situation that it is profitable for the monopolist to serve both groups with a uniform price, and we must have the necessary condition that the monopoly price, the uniform monopoly price, is such that both groups have positive demand, right? And if these two conditions are satisfied, then P hat M, this one here, will be the solution, right? So the profit maximizing strategy of the monopolist. Okay, so let's look at scenario 2. What happens in scenario 2? In scenario 2, we assume that there is price discrimination. So what will the monopolist do? It sets a monopoly price in both groups, right? And the monopoly price in both groups is pretty simple. You just look at group I, and group I has a specific AI, intercept, willingness to pay, and in our example that was 10 for group 2 and 20 for group 1. And you just calculate the monopoly price for that case, which is AI plus C over 2. Pretty standard. And it's clear that demand in both groups will be positive by definition, because you basically try to set monopoly prices in each group. And since there is basically price discrimination, there will be, you just sell to both groups. Now, let us think about the two solutions in more detail. What we see is that if we have a uniform price, group 1 actually pays a lower price with price discrimination. Why? So if you take this joint demand function and you compute a joint uniform monopoly price, then this price will be lower than the monopoly price of group 1 and higher than the monopoly price of group 2, right? So you basically make concession to group 1 and that allows you to serve group 2. For the other group, of course, it's the other way around, right? So the monopoly prices in group 2 would be actually lower than the uniform monopoly price, right? Because the uniform monopoly price basically is oriented on a mixture of the two demands. And since group 2 is smaller and group 1 is larger, the prices will be higher for the smaller group and lower for the larger group. And it's important to interpret what we had before, right? So if you have a situation where the monopoly price, the uniform monopoly price, is actually higher than A2, or if it doesn't make sense for the monopolist to, or if it's not profitable for the monopolist to serve both groups, then it is possible that we have a situation where group 2 is only served if we assume uniform prices. Sorry, that is not correct. With uniform prices, right? So if we have uniform prices, it could be the situation that one group is not served, right? Just because of what we have already analyzed. And therefore, the welfare effects of our third-degree price discrimination is actually ambiguous, right? There might be instances where if you allow for uniform price, joint welfare will increase. And why is that? Well, that happens if the welfare gain in the first group overcompensates the welfare loss in the second group, and both groups are actually served. I think that's a necessary condition in this welfare comparison. However, if this does not hold, right? So if, for instance, one group is not served, if we impose uniform prices, then the welfare effects of price discrimination would actually be, well, it would be good if we allowed for price discrimination, right? Because it would allow for the other market to be served. Now, looking at it from a broader perspective, what does this actually mean? Should we forbid price discrimination? Well, first of all, there are cases where price discrimination is not possible. And one condition for that is that if there is arbitrage, right? So if it's possible, suppose you have price discrimination here, and price discrimination would say that the monopoly price that's cheaper, that you sell cheaper to group 2 than you do for group 1. So you could be a smart person and say, okay, I pose to be a group 2 consumer. For instance, if groups 1 and 2 are different countries, then I buy in the small country where prices are lower, and I sell the product in the large country where prices are higher. And the profit that I make in this process is basically an arbitrage profit, right? And if this is possible, if this is profitable if there could be some arbitrageurs who actually abuse this price difference, then it's not possible to have price discrimination, right? Because the monopoly prices in the large group will basically be skimmed by arbitrageurs, right? So that won't work. The other thing is that there could be a policy, for instance, like we have been talking about abuse of dominance. If we imposed a policy that says price discrimination is illegal because you abuse your dominant position, that would be the potential claim here, then this would sometimes lead to welfare losses because firms are not served by uniform prices, right? And that could be the problem. Okay, that's what I wanted to tell you about uniform prices and price discrimination. Now let's talk about rebates. So usually we think of rebates as something positive. However, rebates can be used as a strategic means to basically, it could even lead to abuse of dominance here. And our retroactive rebates are a type of scheme where if you purchase a certain number of products, then the price for each product will go down. That's basically the idea. And we have an exemplary rebate scheme here to illustrate the idea. Suppose we have a firm A that says, okay, if you purchase less than 10,000 units, you pay €2 per unit, and above this 10,000 units, you offer a 20% rebate. You get 20% rebate. That means that if you buy 10,001 units, you will pay only 160. per unit, whereas if you buy 9,999, you pay 2 euros per unit. So let's just go through examples here. Suppose the consumer purchases 8,000 units. So he pays 2 euros per unit because it's below the threshold where the rebate actually bites, and he pays 16,000 units. Suppose the consumer buys 9,999 units. Then she will pay 19,998 euros, so basically almost 20k. And if the consumer buys 10,000 units, then the rebate starts to bite, and the consumer only pays 160 per unit. So it will she will get the 10,000 units for 16,000 euros. So as if she only purchased 8,000 units here. So from the viewpoint of the consumer, it basically, if there's no saturation points or anything, it basically always makes sense to buy 10,000 units rather than 8,000 units, because you pay the same amount, but you get 2,000 units in advance. And the idea or the problem is, suppose the consumer needs 10,000 units or more, and she has already purchased 8,000 units from A. Then, if there is another firm B that competes with firm A for this consumer, then B would have to give for free 2,000 units to the consumer in order to attract it, right? Because the consumer already purchased 8,000, and it basically gets the next 2,000 units for free because it pays the same amount. So if B was to attract the consumer, it has to give away the first 2,000 units for free just to get the consumer, or to attract the consumer from the other producer. And these retroactive rebates were actually an issue in the Intel case, which had huge fines of 1.2 billion euros. So just look this up, it's a very interesting case. Okay, now let's talk about tying and bundling. Tying means that a product B can only be purchased in combination with a product A. And if we talk about bundling, then we can have pure bundling or mixed bundling. Pure bundling means that you can only purchase A and B jointly. And mixed bundling means that A and B can be purchased jointly or separately, right? So suppose you are thinking about a subscription to certain video or Netflix and stuff system, and suppose that the supplier offered you two packages here. One package that involves a certain set of series or products, and the other set does not. Right, so then we would have a situation of mixed bundling, whereas if you can only subscribe to that service and you get everything, even though you probably just want to watch a certain Netflix series here. Well, Netflix is just an example, just use another streaming service, A and B, or whatever you want, or 1 and 2, whatever you want to call it, but the idea is clear, right? So if there's pure bundling, you get everything, even though you probably don't want 99%, and if it's mixed bundling, you could purchase everything, or you could purchase only separate parts here. So why is that, or why could that be a problem? Well, there could be anti-competitive effects related to it, because if you have market power in market A, you can transfer it to market B, right? By bundling it or tying it. You could also have foreclosure in market B if your good A is essential for good B to actually work, right? So it could be a situation where there's a producer of A and B, and you have your own downstream firm for good A, but there's another downstream firm that would need good A to offer good B as well, right? So that could be a potential issue for foreclosure. However, there could also be pro-competitive effects that could, for instance, be related to cost savings, right? For instance, if it makes sense to have the entire, if you have an app, for instance, that offers the streaming services, then it probably doesn't make sense to completely change the structure of the app just to basically crimp the services. But you could also have saving, you could also save packaging material, which is probably pretty clear, right? So if you have razor and razor blades, then it probably makes sense to sell them jointly by just stacking the products on top of each other, right? Rather than just selling them separately all the time. And that's related to economies of scale and scope, of course. So if you have just these cost savings by producing the two products jointly, right? So if it makes sense, think of a situation where you hire a certain actor and record a series, then it probably makes sense to also use that actor in a different series, for instance, even though that would be kind of, I don't know. I can say that as an economist. It's of course, as an actor, it's a completely different situation, but that's just to illustrate the idea. And the economies of scale is pretty clear as well, because if you produce both products, you could have like you'd only need one TV studio or something, and therefore it makes sense to produce separate, streaming series or something, because you can save, because you can drive down average cost. Okay. Then we have a related problem of primary and secondary markets. Suppose the primary market is a durable good and the secondary market is something that is complementary to that durable goods. So for instance, this is the razor and the complementary product would be the razor blades, right? So the razor itself is pretty solid. It will hold it will be usable for several, probably decades, but you probably don't use the razor blade so long. And basically, if you have a situation where the razor is designed in a way that only certain razor blades fit on top of it, then the consumers are, by purchasing the razor, are locked in also to the razor blade, right? And that is a particular example of the switching costs that we have already discussed, right? So you need to buy the new razor blade, the new razor, in order to use the alternative razor blades, right? And in that situation, you could have an instance of market power if many consumers have already purchased the certain types of razor. We have two examples here from cases. Google Chrome and Android is one example where on every Android phone the Chrome browser was already pre-installed, and that was an issue. Well, think back a few decades earlier, or a few years earlier, with Microsoft and Media Player. That was already on every Microsoft operating system. You had the Media Player installed, and in order to use another or a different Media Player, you just have to download it. And well, nowadays it's probably not a problem, whereas like it depends. If you're here in Germany, you're probably not, I mean, it's better than, it depends, right? So there are countries where you have much better internet connection, but usually downloading another media player is not so much of an issue anymore. But if you think back a few years earlier, then the internet connections were so slow, and sometimes you didn't have like even you had to pay per download megabyte or anything, or something like that. So when you wanted to change the media player, you had to download it first. So you had to incur monetary costs. For instance, if you have like if you pay per downloaded unit, and you needed a certain amount of time to download the actual service, right? And in these situations, it was ruled that basically Microsoft had abused its dominant position by pre-installing the media player, right? Okay, now let's talk about predation. What is the idea? We set predatory prices to drive out competitors. And once the competitors are gone, we have market power because we are alone in the market. And the idea is that you set predatory prices which are sometimes below marginal costs, which lead to losses in the short run, and these losses you have to absorb in order to drive out the competitors and be a monopolist in the long run. So that's basically the trade-off that you're modeling here in the respective models. There, for instance, you could look this up in Tirol's textbook, where it's actually described very nicely that you basically you absorb losses in the short run, you have short run losses, and in the long run you have gains, and if it pays off in the long run, depending on your discount factor, you just pursue this strategy. And if you have multiple firms engaging in such a predatory strategy, then it depends which firm can absorb the financial losses the longest, right? So it's basically like a war of attrition. Well, that's something that is kind of sadly not only related to economic terms, but, well, you know, it's a sad topic. If we think of it against economics, the consumers benefit in the short run from this predatory process because prices are low. But in the long run, we have monopolists, so they lose potentially in the long run. And the point is that efficiency effects, if the market is stable, are pretty much unlikely, right? Because you have basically blocked the market. However, it depends on the stability of the market, of course. So it's probably something that it's probably unlikely, but it's not impossible. Okay, so our last topic we want to discuss is the refusal to supply margin squeeze. So refusal to supply would be associated to an upstream firm not being not wanting to supply a downstream firm, or the other way around, actually. And we could also have situations that we only offer conditions to the other firms that are such that they are not able to compete in a respective market. And if we want to have something like refusal to supply a margin squeeze in the abuse of dominance sense, the good that we are looking at has to be essential. So it doesn't have to be. It must not be something that can easily be substituted, because then we basically don't have market power, right? And that debate is related to essential facilities, where we have the Bronner case in the European Union, basically where it is said that we had a situation where the market access was only possible using an essential facility, right? So from a technical perspective, and in that case, the essential facility it has to be essential in order to be an essential facility, right? That's what I said. If, for instance, the downstream firm or the upstream firm can find other ways to supply the consumers or to offer their products, and if they can easily do that, then we don't have an essential facility, right? So, and these conditions would be that it's not able or it's not profitable, it's impossible or not profitable to duplicate the essential facility. The essential facility has to be relevant and essential for market entry and access. And of course, we have to have a situation where the competition downstream benefits from the essential facility, right? So it has to be a good one. And the firm that offers this essential facility has to be in competition with the firm that is denied the access to it, right? So if we're talking about a three-firm situation where, or four-firm, where one firm has the essential facility, the other firm wants it, so A has the essential facility, B does not, and C wants it, and argues with B, then it's completely pointless here, because basically it's not B that would offer the access to the essential facility because it is related to A. Right, so that would be also the point here. Okay, so that was it for abuse of dominance. So it was only a brief chapter here. If you get into the cases here, that's where it actually matters. Each case is kind of individual in a sense, because you have to have a certain, assessment of each individual case here. It's probably a little bit more individual than what we have had with respect to cartels. That's why we were digging much more into detail with respect to cartel infringements and 101 infringements, because they are basically per se illegal. And if you look at case law, they are very common, actually. So that's something that's where we have put throughout the entire term so much emphasis on mergers and 101 and not so much on this topic here. Nevertheless, it's an interesting topic, so if you want to dig more into that issues, I could also advise you to look at the regulation lecture that we have on our channel. Aside from that, it was a pleasure to give the exercise, the lecture to you all on YouTube. I hope that it's that you have learned something. I hope that it was illuminating in a sense. And if it was, we're always happy if you leave us a like and some comments. And if you want us to address anything else, just send us an email or just leave a comment in the comment section below. We will be notified. And of course, we'll be happy to, if you subscribe to our channel, since we're always trying to produce more content, especially related to our research, where we want to do more in the future. However, keep in mind that right now we're basically just a chair at a regular university, and we're doing that. Well, this is something that I luckily was paid for to offer to you, so I'm very happy to have done that. But usually we do it in our spare time. That's how the channel was created some years ago, and that's how it's based. But nevertheless, we're trying to offer good content for you, and if you like it, if you enjoy it, just tell us. Aside from that, again, thank you for your attention, and hopefully see you in the next one.